The officer who handcuffed her thought he was doing the city a favor. She was just a nurse, tired eyes, worn scrubs, a cheap bag on her shoulder. Standing alone at a bus stop at 11:30 at night. Easy, quiet, nobody. Officer Derek Soane clicked the cuffs on her wrists in front of 17 witnesses and smiled like a man who had already won. He had no idea the woman he just arrested had pulled dying soldiers out of burning wreckage in 3 combat zones, trained special operations medics in the dark, and once kept a 4-man team alive for 6 hours with nothing but field equipment and sheer refusal to quit. His mistake would cost the city of Callaway $4.7 million and his entire career. If this story already has your attention, subscribe to my channel, hit like, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the night it all started. The bus was 22 minutes late. Nora Vass knew because she had been watching the transit app on her phone since 11:08, shifting her weight from one foot to the other on the concrete pad outside Callaway General's East Employee exit. The October air had a bite to it that was unusual for early fall in this part of the state, the kind of cold that got into the joints and stayed there. She'd worked a 13-hour shift. Her feet were past the point of hurting. They had gone numb somewhere around hour 10, which she had learned to treat as a mercy rather than a warning sign. She pulled her jacket tighter and tucked her chin down. The medical bag hanging off her right shoulder was heavier than it looked. Most people assumed nurses carried personal items in bags like that. A phone charger, a granola bar, a pair of spare socks. Nora's bag held something different, a laminated credential folio, 2 trauma tourniquets she never went anywhere without, a compact hemostatic kit she had assembled herself, and underneath all of it, folded flat against the inner lining, a military identification card she hadn't looked at in over 3 years. She didn't think about that card most days. She was a nurse now, an ER nurse at Callaway General, working the night shift in the trauma bay, doing the same job she'd done in other places under very different circumstances. The transition had taken time. Civilian medicine moved differently, slower in some ways, more bureaucratic, interrupted constantly by insurance questions and charting requirements that didn't exist in the field. But the work itself, the actual work of keeping people alive, felt the same. That part she still knew how to do. The transit app updated. Bus delayed 34 minutes. Nora exhaled through her nose and looked down the empty street. The block adjacent to Callaway General's east exit wasn't particularly well lit. There was a CVS across the intersection that had closed at 10, its windows dark. A laundromat to the north, also dark. The bus shelter itself was functional but aging. A cracked plastic panel on the east side, a bench with a broken back support, a light fixture that flickered every 40 seconds with remarkable consistency. She had timed it once. She was the only person at the stop. She did not hear the patrol car until it had already slowed to a crawl alongside the curb. The vehicle was a Callaway PD cruiser, white and blue, moving without its overhead lights. It rolled up and stopped with its front bumper roughly even with her position. The driver's side window came down. "Hey!" Nora looked up. The officer behind the wheel was somewhere in his mid-30s, thick through the shoulders, with a close-cropped haircut, and the particular look of someone who had been sitting in that car for a long time and was bored with it. His name tag, visible even in the low light, read Soane. "You waiting for something?" "The bus," Nora said. "At this hour?" "It runs until midnight. I just finished a shift." Soane looked at her for a moment without expression. Then he put the car in park and opened his door. That was the first thing that didn't make sense. She hadn't done anything. She was standing at a public bus stop with a medical bag on her shoulder, wearing scrubs with the Callaway General logo on the left breast pocket. There was no observable reason for him to get out of the car. He came around the front of the vehicle and stopped about 5 feet from her, thumbs hooked into his belt. "You work at the hospital?" "Yes." "What department?" Nora looked at him steadily. "Emergency. Why?" "Just asking." He let his eyes move over her. Not the look of someone conducting a safety check, but the look of someone calculating. "You have ID on you?" "You want to see identification." "That's what I said." She didn't reach for anything immediately. "Can I ask what this is about?" "I'm standing at a public bus stop. I haven't done anything." His expression shifted slightly. Not anger yet. Something closer to the anticipation of it. "I'm asking you a straightforward question. You making this difficult?" I'm asking you a lawful question, Nora said. Her voice was even. She wasn't performing calm. She actually was calm in the particular way that people become calm when they've been trained for situations where panic is the most expensive reaction available. What's the basis for this stop? Soane stepped closer. You were observed loitering in the area. I've been standing at a bus stop for 6 minutes. We've had reports of suspicious activity in this block. What kind of suspicious activity? Ma'am, I need you to stop asking me questions and cooperate. I'm not refusing to cooperate. I'm asking for a reason. She shifted the bag on her shoulder. That's not the same thing. What happened next took about 4 seconds. Soane reached out and grabbed her left arm above the wrist. He spun her toward the patrol car with more force than the situation required, enough that her shoulder hit the vehicle's trunk with a solid impact, and had the first cuff on before she could fully process the sequence. Stop resisting, he said loudly. She had not resisted. She had not moved. I'm not resisting, she said, keeping her voice flat and even. I'm not resisting. There are cameras at that CVS. The second cuff clicked into place. There were, in fact, 3 witnesses she could see from her position. A man walking a dog on the far side of the intersection who had stopped moving, a woman who had stepped out of a parked car half a block north and was now standing very still, and a teenager on a bicycle who had slowed to a stop near the laundromat entrance. All of them were watching. Soane walked her to the rear door of his cruiser and opened it. His movements were efficient but not rushed, the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before. You have the right to remain silent, he said, as if reciting a grocery list. Nora Vass said nothing for the rest of the ride to the precinct. The Callaway PD District 4 station was 12 minutes from the hospital. Nora had driven past it hundreds of times without ever having a reason to go inside. The building was blocky and institutional, 2 stories of 70s-era municipal architecture, with a parking structure on the south side and a processing entrance on the north. Soane brought her in through the north door. The desk officer barely looked up when they came through. Got a detainee, Soane said. Loitering, failure to cooperate. The desk officer, a heavy-set woman in her 50s whose name tag read Delacour, glanced at Nora with the brief, professionally neutral look of someone who had processed several hundred people through that door and had long since stopped wondering about most of them. Bag goes in property, Delacour said. That's a medical bag, Nora said clearly. It contains controlled medical supplies. It needs to be logged carefully, and noted, Delacour said, already looking at her screen. I need to speak to a supervisor. You'll have the opportunity. I'd like to make that request now, on the record. Delacour looked at her for a moment. Okay. Request noted. Nora was processed, fingerprinted, photographed, seated in a holding area with 2 empty benches and a water-stained ceiling, without any supervisor appearing. The medical bag was taken. She watched it go through a door marked property, with the specific attention of someone cataloging exactly what was happening to it. She knew what was in that bag. She knew what they would find. The question was whether finding it would make things better or worse. She leaned her head back against the cinder block wall and closed her eyes. Her shoulder, where it had hit the trunk of the cruiser, had developed a dull ache that she assessed clinically and filed away. Not fractured. Soft tissue contusion, probably. She would deal with it later. From down the hallway, she could hear Soane talking to someone. His voice carried the relaxed confidence of a man who believed he was on solid ground. She was giving me a hard time from the start. Wouldn't identify herself, kept questioning everything, made a scene. Was she actually resisting? She was uncooperative. That's not resisting, Derek. She got physical when I went to Did she? A pause. She made the situation difficult. Another pause, and then the second voice, quieter, careful, said something Nora couldn't make out clearly. She didn't need to. The fact that someone was pushing back on Soane's account, even mildly, was information. She had been in holding for approximately 40 minutes when the property room door opened again and a different officer came out. Young, maybe 27, with the look of someone who hadn't expected to be the one dealing with this. He was carrying her medical bag. Ms. Vass? Yes. He came to the threshold of the holding area and stopped. He looked at the bag, then at her, then at the bag again. Can you tell me what this is? He held up the laminated credential folio. This identification. Open it, Nora said. He already had. That was why he looked like that. The credential folio contained 4 items: her current nursing license, her Callaway General Employee ID, a National Registry of Emergency Medical Technicians card at the advanced level, and a single sheet of paper, official letterhead, dated 3 years and 4 months ago. That was a formal letter of commendation from the commanding officer of the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force Medical Battalion. It referenced, in bureaucratic but unmistakable language, her service as an attached Navy trauma medic, the specific operational deployments she had supported, and one incident in particular that the letter described as extraordinary performance under fire resulting in the preservation of life for 4 personnel who would otherwise have been lost. The young officer read it twice. Nora could tell because his eyes went back to the top of the page. "You were in the Navy," he said. "Navy corpsman. Attached to Marine units, 6 years. Combat deployments, 3. He looked at her, then at the letter, then at her again. He was putting things together in a way that she could watch happen across his face. "And you were arrested for loitering at a bus stop." "I was arrested for standing at a bus stop and asking Officer Soane to explain the basis for his stop." The young officer, his tag read Maarto, said nothing for a moment. Then he said quietly, "I need to get Sergeant Fennick." He left. He came back in 4 minutes with a woman who was clearly the sergeant, late 40s, short gray-streaked hair, the compressed energy of someone managing 17 problems at once. She was carrying the credential folio herself now. She looked at Nora for a moment before saying anything. "Ms. Vass, I'm Sergeant Alicia Fennick. I want to apologize for—" "Where is Officer Soane's incident report?" Nora said. Fennick paused. "It's being completed. I want a copy, tonight. I can arrange. I also want the full name and badge number of every officer who was present during my processing, and I want confirmation that my request to speak to a supervisor was noted in the intake log at the time I made it." Fennick's expression shifted. Not defensive, more careful. "You understand we still need to sort out the circumstances." "The circumstances," Nora said, "are that I was standing at a public bus stop after a 13-hour shift. I was stopped without cause. I asked a lawful question about the basis for the stop, and I was physically restrained and transported here without committing any offense. I haven't been charged with anything because there's nothing to charge me with." The room was quiet. "I'd like to be uncuffed," Nora said, "and I'd like to make a phone call." Well, the call she made was not to a lawyer, not yet. She called her former unit's administrative contact number, a number she hadn't dialed in over 3 years but still had memorized, and left a message that was brief and specific. She gave her name, her service number, and the name of the facility where she was being held. She said she had been detained and requested that her service record be flagged as potentially relevant to an ongoing legal situation. Then she sat back down in the holding area and waited. Sergeant Fennick had her uncuffed. She had been moved to a different room, smaller, with a table and 2 chairs, which in the taxonomy of these things was an improvement. Someone brought her a paper cup of water that tasted like it had been sitting in a cooler for several days. She drank it anyway. Officer Soane appeared in the doorway once, briefly. He looked at her with the expression of a man who was recalibrating. She met his gaze and said nothing. After a moment, he left. This was the part of the night that was hardest, and not because she was afraid. She wasn't afraid. She was tired, her shoulder ached, and she was angry in the measured operational way she had learned to be angry, the kind of anger that didn't dissipate, that she could fold up and carry forward and use later instead of burning it now on a room full of people who weren't worth the expenditure. She had learned that in the field. Anger without direction was noise. Anger with patience was something else entirely. At 1:47 in the morning, the door to the small room opened and Sergeant Fennick came back in. Behind her was a man Nora didn't recognize. Civilian clothes, early 50s, the particular bearing of someone who carried institutional authority in their posture rather than their uniform. He was holding a phone to his ear, finishing a conversation, and when he ended the call, he looked at Nora the way people looked at things they were resorting in their head. "Ms. Vass," Fennick said, "this is Deputy Chief Warren Mack. He wanted to speak with you directly." Mack sat down across from her without preamble. "I've been briefed on your service record." "Okay. I want to say, on behalf of the department, that Did Officer Soane file his incident report yet? Mac blinked once. I believe it's being finalized. Has anyone pulled the security footage from the CVS across from the bus stop? A pause. We're looking into... There's also a camera on the streetlight at the northeast corner of that intersection, city operated, and the hospital's east entrance has an exterior camera with a line of sight to the bus stop. It's been there for about 8 months. Nora folded her hands on the table. Before Officer Soane finalizes that report, someone should probably watch all 3 of those. The silence in the room changed quality. Mac looked at Fenwick. Fenwick looked at the table. Ms. Vass, Mac said carefully, what is it you want to happen here? Tonight? I want to go home. I want a copy of Officer Soane's incident report as filed, and I want written confirmation that my property was inventoried correctly. And after tonight? Nora looked at him for a moment. After tonight isn't tonight's conversation. She was released at 2:23 in the morning. No charges. No official record of an arrest. What the desk officer told her, awkwardly, was that the situation was being reclassified as a field contact. She took the paperwork they handed her, signed nothing she didn't read completely first, and retrieved her medical bag from the property window. She checked the bag in the parking lot before she got into the cab she'd called from the property room phone. Everything was there. The tourniquets, the hemostatic kit, the folio. The military ID beneath the lining, still exactly where she had placed it. The cab driver didn't say anything to her on the way home. Either he sensed that she wasn't in a conversational mood, or he genuinely wasn't interested, and either way she was grateful for it. She watched Calloway go past the window, the downtown blocks giving way to the quieter residential grid of her neighborhood, the 24-hour gas station on her corner, the parking lot of the grocery store that wouldn't open for another 4 hours. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that had been converted from a warehouse sometime in the 90s. She had chosen it for practical reasons. Good locks, 1 stairwell, a unit on a corner with sight lines in 2 directions. Old habits. She dropped her bag on the kitchen counter and stood in the dark for a moment. Then she went to the small desk in her bedroom, opened the bottom drawer, and took out a legal pad and a pen. She sat down and began writing, not in the urgent, agitated way of someone venting, carefully, chronologically, in the precise and sequential format she had been trained to use for after-action reports. Time of initial contact, 11:14 p.m. Officer identification, Soane, D, badge number visible, District 4. Nature of contact, unprompted traffic stop of pedestrian at public transit stop. First verbal exchange. She wrote for 40 minutes. When she was done, she had 6 pages of tight, ordered notes covering every exchange, every visible witness, every detail of the processing procedure, and the conversation she had overheard through the holding room wall. She read it back once, corrected 2 time estimates, and put it in the front pocket of her medical bag. Then she went to the kitchen and made tea, because it was almost 3 in the morning and she knew she wasn't going to sleep. She was sitting at the kitchen table with the tea going cold when her phone rang. Unknown number. She looked at it for a moment, then answered. Miss Vass? The voice was unfamiliar, older, measured, with the clipped precision of someone who had spent a long time in institutions that valued efficiency. My name is Commander Arlene Bryce. I'm with the Judge Advocate General's Office, Naval Legal Service Command. I received a message through administrative channels regarding your situation tonight. Nora set down her mug. That was fast. We flag service member contacts immediately when the circumstances fit certain parameters. A brief pause. Can you describe what happened? Nora described it. She gave the same account she had written on the legal pad, in the same order, without editorializing. Commander Bryce listened without interruption and asked 4 clarifying questions when Nora finished. The name of the supervising officer, the time of the property room review, whether Nora had been advised of charges at any point, and whether the incident report had been made available. It hasn't been provided yet, Nora said. I was told it was being finalized. That's interesting timing. I thought so too. Ms. Vass, based on what you've described, you have a very strong civil rights claim. The department is going to move quickly to contain this, which means they're going to be very friendly to you in the next 48 hours, while simultaneously doing everything they can to manage the record. The incident report is going to be critical. I know. Do you have legal representation? Not yet. I can refer you to civilian attorneys who specialize in this area. I can also tell you that the military has some institutional interest in how this situation is handled, given your service record and the circumstances of your detention." Nora was quiet for a moment. Through her kitchen window, she could see the parking lot below, still and empty, a single security light casting a yellow oval on the asphalt. "Commander Bryce," she said, "the officer who arrested me, did he file a report that says I was resisting?" A pause. "I don't have access to that yet. He's going to say I was resisting. That's what he told the other officer I could hear him telling. He's going to say I was uncooperative, that I made the situation difficult, that he had a reason." Nora picked up her mug and set it back down. "I need you to understand something. I'm not someone who makes a noise and then walks away. I'm going to follow this until there's nowhere else for it to go." "I understand. And there are 3 cameras that saw everything." Another pause, longer this time. "Ms. Vass, Commander Bryce said, and there was something different in her voice now. Not warmer, exactly, but more direct. "I've read your service record, the commendation from the MEF Medical Battalion, the operational history." "Okay, what Officer Soane did tonight, handcuffing a decorated combat medical specialist at a bus stop because she asked him to explain himself. That is not going to play well. Not for him, not for the department, and not for anyone who signed off on his conduct." Nora looked at the legal pad on the table, 6 pages of careful handwriting. "I want his incident report," she said, "unedited. Whatever he wrote in the 45 minutes between bringing me in and Deputy Chief Mack showing up. That's the version I want." "Why that version specifically?" "Because it's the version he wrote before he knew what was in my bag." The line was quiet. Then Commander Bryce said, "I'll make some calls in the morning." Nora said goodnight, ended the call, and sat in her kitchen until the sky outside began to go gray at the edges. She didn't sleep. She thought about Soane's face when he had looked at her through the holding room doorway. That particular recalibrating expression, the small visible adjustment of a man beginning to understand that something had shifted under his feet, but not yet knowing how far the ground was going to move. He still didn't know. Not really. By the time the morning light came through the kitchen window and the first buses of the day started running on the street below, 3 things were already in motion that Derek Soane had no idea existed. Commander Bryce's phone calls, the preservation request for the city's streetlight camera system that had been submitted at 6:02 a.m. by a paralegal at the JAG office, and a conversation happening between Nora's building super and a woman who had been walking her dog near the intersection at 11:14 the previous night and had filmed 40 seconds of it on her phone before the angle went wrong. Soane thought he had arrested a nurse. He had arrested someone who documented everything, remembered everything, and had just spent the last 3 hours writing it all down in the same methodical format she had used to file combat after-action reports in places where getting the record wrong cost people their lives. He had no idea what was coming. And somewhere across the city, in the District 4 precinct, an incident report was sitting in a queue, written by a tired and increasingly nervous officer, full of language about resistance and uncooperation and suspicious behavior, waiting to collide with 40 seconds of cell phone video and 3 security camera feeds that had recorded every second of the truth. The incident report landed in the wrong inbox first. That was the detail that would matter later. Not the content of the report itself, though the content was bad enough, but the sequence. At 6:47 in the morning, before the day shift had fully turned over, a civilian records clerk named Paulette Andro processed the overnight paperwork and routed Soane's incident report to the District 4 supervisor's shared folder, standard procedure. What was not standard was that she also, out of habit from a previous assignment, CC'd the department's internal affairs liaison on anything flagged with a detention notation. It was a holdover process from a policy that had been quietly discontinued 8 months earlier, and nobody had told Paulette to stop doing it. So while Soane was still asleep, his incident report, the original, unrevised version, time-stamped at 1:19 a.m., was sitting in the inbox of Lieutenant Gara Weiss, Internal Affairs Division, who arrived at her desk at 7:10 and read it with the particular attention of someone whose entire job was noticing when paperwork didn't match reality. The report said Nora Vass had been observed exhibiting suspicious behavior in a high-incident zone. It said she had refused to identify herself and became physically combative when Officer Soane attempted to conduct a welfare check. It used the phrase resisted transport twice. It described the subject as agitated and uncooperative throughout processing. Weiss read it once. Then she pulled the intake log from the same overnight period, which had been filed by Desk Officer Delacour, and read that. The intake log described a female detainee who had entered the facility calmly, requested to speak to a supervisor, and been assigned to holding without incident. 2 documents. Same night, same person, different story. Weiss put both documents side by side on her desk and looked at them for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and called the District 4 property room. The detainee from last night, but the nurse. Her bag was inventoried? Yes, ma'am. What was in it? A pause, the sound of a keyboard. Medical supplies. Nursing credentials. And, hold on, a military ID and a letter. Some kind of commendation letter. From a Marine unit. Weiss was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Who saw that letter last night? Officer Myrto logged it. Then Sergeant Fennick. Then Deputy Chief Mack came in, so Mack was there in person? Yes, ma'am. He came in around 1:30. She thanked the property officer and ended the call. Then she sat back in her chair and thought about what it meant that the deputy chief had personally driven to a district station at 1:30 in the morning over a loitering arrest of a woman who turned out to have a military commendation letter in her bag. The answer she arrived at was not a comfortable one. She made 2 more calls before 8 o'clock. The second one was to the city's traffic monitoring division, requesting a hold on all footage from the camera at the northeast corner of Mercer and Callaway East from the previous night. She cited an ongoing review. She didn't explain further. The footage was preserved at 8:22 a.m. At 8:51 a.m., Soane arrived at the district station for the start of his shift, poured himself coffee, and was standing at the break room counter scrolling his phone when Sergeant Fennick appeared in the doorway. Derek, my office. He followed her down the hall with the mildly wary expression of someone who expected a minor inconvenience and was not especially concerned. He had filed his report. He had his version. The nurse had been released without charges, which was standard management of an arrest that got complicated, and the whole thing would settle into the administrative background noise of a busy district station. That was how these things worked. That was how they had always worked. He sat down across from Fennick, and she closed the door. Tell me about last night, she said. Filed the report. She was hanging around the hospital block, wouldn't cooperate. Derek. Fennick set a single sheet of paper on the desk between them and turned it so he could read it. It was the traffic camera preservation request, time-stamped 40 minutes ago. IA pulled the footage from Mercer and Callaway East before anyone asked them to. The coffee cup in his hand didn't move, but something in his posture changed. A very small, almost invisible contraction. Okay, he said. The CVS has exterior cameras. The hospital has an exterior camera with a direct line to that stop. A woman walking her dog filmed about 40 seconds of it on her phone before you put Ms. Vass in the car. Fennick kept her voice level. I'm telling you this now, Derek, because you still have a very narrow window to amend your report before this gets to a place where amending it is no longer an option. Soane looked at the paper. He looked at his coffee. He set the cup down on the desk. She was being difficult, he said finally. That's not what I'm seeing in the intake log. She questioned everything I said. She asked you to explain the basis for the stop, Fennick said, which she is legally entitled to do, and you put her in cuffs. She leaned forward slightly. She was in scrubs with a hospital ID visible on her pocket, Derek. She was at a bus stop. What did you think you were doing? He didn't answer immediately. The silence in the room had a particular quality. Not the silence of someone thinking, but the silence of someone realizing that the story they had been telling themselves wasn't going to hold the shape they had given it. I made a judgment call, he said. You made a judgment call that's now in the hands of the JAG office. That landed differently. He looked up. What? She's a former Navy corpsman, combat deployments. She made a call last night to the Judge Advocate General's Naval Legal Service Command, and they have been in contact with Department Administration since approximately 7 this morning. Fennick picked up the paper and squared it against the edge of the desk. Her attorney, and she will have an attorney by the end of the day, if she doesn't already, is going to request your original incident report. The one you filed at 1:19 this morning, before you knew what was in her bag. The room was very quiet. Think about what's in that report, Fennick said. Think about what the camera footage is going to show. and then decide if you want to talk to the union rep before this goes any further. Nora slept for 3 hours. She hadn't intended to sleep at all, had expected to lie down and simply wait for a reasonable hour to start making calls. But somewhere around 5:30, with the legal pad full of notes on the table and the tea gone completely cold, her body simply stopped negotiating. She woke at 8:44, disoriented for exactly the length of time it took to feel the ache in her shoulder, and then she remembered everything with the immediate clarity of someone whose nervous system had processed the night during sleep and had the results waiting. She showered, changed, and called Callaway General to report that she would not be coming in. She reached the charge nurse coordinator, a woman named Pat Sorrells, who had been working that floor since before Nora arrived, and gave a brief explanation. She'd had a situation overnight and needed to deal with it. Pat asked if she was okay. Nora said she was fine. It was mostly true. Then she called the number Commander Bryce had provided, a civilian attorney named Desmond Ott, who turned out to be a former military JAG officer himself, which explained the referral chain. He answered on the second ring and was ready for her. Bryce had clearly already briefed him. "I've requested a hold on your record from the overnight," Ott said. He had a quick, lateral thinking quality in his speech that she found useful. "Before we do anything else, I want to see what Soane actually put in that report. Are you comfortable giving me authorization to request it?" "Yes. I want it subpoenaed if they won't provide it voluntarily." "Let's try voluntary first. Sometimes the threat of the subpoena is enough to get you what you need faster, and it tells you something about how they're going to handle this based on how they respond." A brief pause. "Ms. Vass, I want to be direct with you. Based on what Commander Bryce described, this is a strong case. The circumstances are clear. Your background is, frankly, remarkable in terms of what it does to the narrative of what happened. And the fact that there's camera coverage is significant. But I want to set your expectations correctly. These cases take time. The city is going to do everything it can to slow this down, settle it quietly, and minimize the public record." "I'm not interested in quiet." Another pause. "Okay. Tell me what you want." "I want the original incident report. I want the complete camera footage from all 3 sources. I want every complaint ever filed against Soane. Formal, informal, any internal documentation. And I want to know who his supervisors were and what they knew." She was standing at her kitchen window, watching a delivery truck pull into the grocery store lot below. "And I want this to be a matter of public record." Ott was quiet for a moment. "The public record piece is going to be the hardest. The city has a lot of tools to keep personnel matters internal. Then we'll have to give them a reason to make it external." "What kind of reason?" "The kind that already exists. Multiple cameras, a JAG notification, a civil rights attorney on record before 9 a.m. If someone with a story like mine gets arrested for asking a question at a bus stop, and there's footage of all of it, that's not a personnel matter, that's news." She turned away from the window. "I'm not calling anybody yet, but the option exists." "Understood." She heard him writing something. "Don't call anyone until we talk. Let me see the report first." She agreed, ended the call, and ate a piece of toast standing over the kitchen sink because she hadn't eaten anything since the granola bar she'd had at 10 the previous night, and her body was sending increasingly insistent notifications about that. The toast was plain. She didn't taste it. She was running calculations. The center of it was still the incident report. Everything else, the cameras, the witnesses, the military record, the JAG involvement, all of it was pressure. But the report was the axis. Whatever Soane had written in those 45 minutes before Deputy Chief Mack walked in, that was the document that would either contradict the cameras or confirm them. Either way, it told the truth about something. It told the truth about what Derek Soane thought he could get away with. By noon, 3 things had happened that Nora didn't know about yet. The first was that Internal Affairs Lieutenant Weiss had formally opened a preliminary inquiry, which was not yet an investigation, but was the step directly before one, a distinction that mattered procedurally and would matter significantly in the days ahead. The second was that a man named Theo Barbas, who was a reporter for the Callaway City Register and had been covering the police beat for 11 years, received a tip from a source he described later only as someone at the station who has a conscience. The tip was brief. A nurse got arrested last night for standing at a bus stop and asking a question, and she turns out to be a decorated military veteran. Barbas wrote it down, looked at it for a moment, and started making calls. The third thing was that Officer Derek Soane, in the union representative's office at District 4, made the decision not to amend his report. The union rep, a stocky man named Castellan, who had navigated the department's disciplinary system for decades, had laid out the situation plainly. The footage was going to show what it showed. The report said what it said. The two were not going to be reconcilable, and amending now was worse optics than admitting error. But saying nothing and letting IA do its work was the tactical play. Create distance, let the process run, and position it as a good faith arrest that had an unfortunate outcome given information that wasn't available at the time of the stop. Soane had listened to all of this and then said, "She was acting suspicious." Castellan had looked at him for a long moment. "Derek," he said, "she was in a hospital uniform at a hospital bus stop. She was hostile. She asked you why you stopped her. She made it into a confrontation." Castellan closed his folder. He was not a man who dealt in illusions about the people he represented. He had been doing this too long for that. But there was something in Soane's insistence that was different from the standard defensive posture. It wasn't just self-protection. It was genuine conviction. Derek Soane actually believed that asking a question about the basis of a police stop was the kind of behavior that warranted a physical response. That, Castellan knew, was going to be a problem that no procedural positioning could fully solve. "Don't talk to anyone without me present," he told Soane. "No statements, no informal conversations, nothing." Soane left the office. He went back to his patrol assignment because he had not been suspended yet, and there was no official reason to pull him from duty while the preliminary inquiry was still preliminary. He drove his sector. He was quiet on the radio. He did not drive past the bus stop. Nora. Desmond Ott in person for the first time at 2:15 in the afternoon, at a coffee shop near the courthouse district that he had clearly chosen for its proximity to the buildings he would need to walk to later. He was around 60, compact, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a legal pad that he carried the way some people carried a preferred tool, comfortably, automatically. He had already filed 2 formal document requests before she arrived. They sat in the back corner. Ott spread 3 pages of notes on the table between them and walked her through what he'd learned in 4 hours of calls. "Soane has 2 prior complaints on record," he said. "One from 4 years ago. A man claimed unlawful detention. It was investigated and closed without finding. One from 18 months ago. A woman claimed she was roughed up during a traffic stop. Also closed. Both complainants were unrepresented. Both were lower-income individuals. Neither had the resources to push it past the initial review." Nora picked up the page and looked at the names. A man named Goret and a woman named Desta Yoon. 2 people who had been through a version of what she had been through and had ended up nowhere. "We're going to need to talk to both of them," she said. Ott nodded slowly. "I was going to suggest that. If we can establish a pattern, it's not a pattern yet. 2 incidents might be a pattern. Might be bad luck. We need their accounts." She set the page down. "Did you get anything on the report?" "They're delaying, citing administrative review process, which tells me someone has seen what's in it and is trying to decide how much damage it does." He took his reading glasses down from his forehead and put them on, looking at his notes. "What I can do is file through the public records process simultaneously, which creates a parallel clock. They can't slow down the same way. It'll take longer, but it'll be harder to intercept. Do both. Already in motion." He looked at her over the top of his glasses. "The JAG office called me this morning. Commander Bryce wants to know your level of comfort with them having a more active institutional role, meaning they may want to be present if this goes to any kind of formal proceeding." Nora thought about that. The military presence was a double-edged element. On one hand, it added institutional weight that a private individual couldn't replicate. On the other hand, it shifted the framing of the story, from a nurse asking a reasonable question to a veteran asserting protections, which was a different argument and one that implied the stop would have been acceptable if the person standing at the bus stop had less impressive credentials. That framing bothered her. "Tell Bryce I appreciate the support," she said carefully. "But I want to be clear about something. The case I'm making is not that what happened to me was wrong because of my record. It's that what happened to me was wrong, period. My record is evidence. It's not the reason." Ott took his glasses off again and looked at her directly. "That distinction matters." "I know it does." He made a note. The coffee shop around them was filling up with the mid-afternoon crowd. Students, people on laptops, a table of women with strollers who were conducting a conversation at a volume that assumed everyone nearby was interested. Nora looked out the window at the street. Ordinary afternoon. The kind of afternoon that existed at the same time as everything else, indifferent to it. One more thing, Ott said. A reporter named Theo Barbas from the Register called my office about 20 minutes before you arrived. He's already working the story. Someone talked. I didn't. I know, I believe you. He tapped his pen against the legal pad. The question is what you want to do about it. We can decline comment and let him work with what he has, which isn't much yet. Or we can control some of the narrative by giving him a brief, careful statement that establishes the basic facts from your perspective before whatever version Soane's camp puts out. Nora was quiet for a moment. What would you put in that statement? Just the facts. You finished a shift. You were at a bus stop. You asked the officer to explain the basis for his stop. You were arrested without charge and released without charge. He paused. Nothing about your background. Not yet. Let them find that. Why? He smiled slightly. Not a warm smile, but the smile of someone who had been doing this long enough to have opinions about timing. Because when they find it themselves, it's a better story than when you tell it, and it's more embarrassing for the department. She considered it for a long moment. Then she nodded. Ott drafted the statement on his phone in approximately 4 minutes. She read it, changed 2 words, and he sent it. They had been sitting in that corner booth for 50 minutes when Ott's phone rang. He looked at the number, frowned slightly, and answered. He said very little, mostly listened. And when he ended the call, he set the phone down on the table with the particular deliberateness of someone managing a reaction. That was a contact at City Hall, he said. Deputy Chief Mack has requested an urgent meeting with the city attorney's office this afternoon. Nora looked at him. They're already looking at settlement exposure, Ott said. That's what that meeting is. They're not doing that unless someone has seen the camera footage. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. What does the footage show? I don't have it yet. But whatever it shows, they've already decided it's bad enough to start a settlement conversation before you've filed anything. Outside the window, the afternoon light had gone gray. A bus rolled past on the street, the same transit line that ran to the hospital. The number on the front matched the one she'd been waiting for the night before. Desmond, she said, what does it mean for the case if the city moves fast to settle? Depends on what they offer and what conditions they attach. They'll want confidentiality. They'll want language limiting what you can say publicly. He picked up his coffee. Standard damage control. And if I don't want confidentiality? He set the coffee back down without drinking it. Then this gets significantly more complicated and significantly more public. He looked at her steadily. And a lot more expensive for them. Nora nodded slowly, like someone who had already known the answer and just needed to hear it said out loud. She reached into her bag and pulled out the legal pad. 6 pages of after-action notes, the same format she had used in the field, the same discipline of recording what happened. So that later, when memory softened and accounts diverged, there was something that couldn't be argued with. She put it on the table between them. Then let's make it complicated, she said. Ott looked at the notepad. He picked it up, read the first page, and then turned to the second without putting it down again. When he got to the part where she described the sequence of the physical restraint, the grip, the force, the contact with the patrol car trunk, the time between Soane's first reach and the second cuff clicking into place, he stopped and looked up at her. You timed this? He said. Force of habit. He looked at the notes again, and something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of recalibration similar to the one she had seen on Officer Myrto's face the night before when he read the commendation letter. He turned to the 6th page, read to the bottom, and set the pad down. Ms. Vass, he said, I have been doing this for 23 years. I want you to know something. He tapped the edge of the legal pad once. I have never seen a client produce documentation this precise this quickly. I filed a lot of after-action reports, she said. This isn't an after-action report. No, but it's the same idea. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, the city attorney's meeting with Mack is at 4:30. By tomorrow morning, when they realize we have this, he tapped the pad again, and the cameras and potentially 2 prior complainants and a JAG office on record. The conversation they're having right now is going to look very different to them. Nora's phone buzzed on the table. Unknown number. She picked it up. Ms. Vass? A voice she didn't recognize, cautious, female, speaking quietly as if from a small space. My name is Desta Yoon. I got your attorney's number from… It doesn't matter how. I heard something is happening with Derek Soane. Nora looked at Ott. He was already listening. Yes, she said. Something is. 18 months ago he stopped me, Desta Yoon said, on a traffic stop. And they closed the complaint. They told me there was nothing there. She took a short breath. I still have the photos. From that night. I never deleted them. Nora asked Desta Yoon to hold the line for 30 seconds. She covered the phone with her hand and looked at Ott. He had already pulled a fresh page on his legal pad. He circled one word he'd written, photos. She brought the phone back up. Ms. Yoon, where are you right now? I'm at work. I'm in the break room. Can you leave work in the next hour? A pause. I get off at 4. Can you come to where we are? She gave the address of the coffee shop. Ott was already nodding. We'll be here until 5:30. Another pause, longer. Somewhere because last time I went through the whole process and it went nowhere and it cost me… Her voice tightened. It cost me. I can't do that again. I understand. Nora thought about how to say the next part accurately without promising what she couldn't guarantee. The situation is different this time. We have 3 camera sources covering the incident. We have JAG involvement. We have an attorney who already has document requests filed. And we're looking at his prior complaints specifically because we need to build a complete picture. She paused. Your photos may be the thing that makes the difference between one bad night and a documented pattern. That's not nothing. The line was quiet for a moment. I'll be there at 4:15, Desta Yoon said, and ended the call. Ott was looking at her. You were careful about what you promised. I've been in situations where someone oversold a possible outcome, Nora said. It doesn't help anyone. He nodded, making a note. Outside, the bus she'd been watching earlier had rounded the corner and disappeared, and the street had gone back to ordinary afternoon. She pulled the legal pad back toward herself and turned to a new page. Desta Yoon, 18 months, photos not deleted. She wrote it in the same compact shorthand she'd used for everything else. And it occurred to her in a peripheral way that she had now been running at operational tempo for going on 15 hours on 3 hours of sleep and a piece of plain toast, and that her body was going to have opinions about that eventually. Just not yet. Not until this was further along. Desta Yoon arrived at 4:12, 3 minutes early, wearing a pharmacy technician's jacket over her street clothes, and the careful expression of someone who had learned to keep their face in neutral in unfamiliar rooms. She was 34, compact, with dark eyes that took in the back corner of the coffee shop with quick assessment before she sat down. She ordered nothing. She put her phone on the table and opened her photo roll. The photos were from 18 months ago, 17 images taken over the course of approximately 40 minutes, starting with a shot through her car's windshield of Soane's patrol car behind her, lights going, and ending with one taken at the hospital where she'd gone after. The hospital photos were the ones that changed the temperature of the room. 3 images of a left forearm with contusion bruising along the radius. Distinct, linear, consistent with contact against a hard edge. 1 image of her face, left side, showing what was clearly the early stage of periorbital bruising around her eye socket. OTT looked at the photos without touching the phone. He looked at them methodically, the way you look at things when you're building a sequence in your head. You went to the hospital that night, he said. Urgent care, not the ER. Desta kept her voice even. I didn't want to make it bigger than I thought I could handle. I went to urgent care. They documented the injuries. I have those records. You kept the records. I kept everything. I thought, when I filed the complaint, I thought it would matter. They interviewed me twice, and both times it felt like they were looking for the reason my account was wrong, not looking at what happened. She pressed her lips together briefly. The investigator told me there was no corroborating evidence. Nora looked at the arm photo. They had your medical records. They said the injuries were consistent with a fall. The room was quiet for a moment. Miss Yoon, Ott said, I'd like to formally include your account and your documentation in the record we're building. That requires your consent and some paperwork, and it means you may be asked to give a statement if this proceeds to any formal proceeding. I want to be honest about what that involves. He looked at her directly. It's not easy. They're going to look for inconsistencies in your account. They're going to examine your history, and there will be periods where nothing seems to be moving. But your documentation is genuine, it's dated, and it contradicts the closure of your complaint in a way that's now going to be very hard for anyone to ignore. Desta Yoon looked at the photo of her own arm on the phone screen for a moment. He never got anything, she said. It wasn't a question. No. She picked up the phone, locked the screen, put it in her jacket pocket. Then yes, whatever you need. By 5 o'clock, Ott had photographed every image with consent documented, drafted a preliminary witness authorization, and called his paralegal to begin pulling the urgent care records through proper channels. Nora sat across from Desta Yoon while Ott made his calls, and the two women didn't talk much, but they didn't need to. There was a specific kind of recognition that happened between people who had been through versions of the same thing, not solidarity exactly, something quieter and more factual than that. An acknowledgement. When Ott came back to the table, he had one more piece of information. Theo Barbas called again, he said. He sat down and looked at Nora. He found the dog walker, the woman who filmed the clip. Nora set down her coffee. Already. He's been working his contacts all day. She sent him the footage. Ott's expression was careful. He's running the story tomorrow. He's giving us until 8 tonight to comment further. Nora thought about the 40 seconds of footage. The angle going wrong before the cuffs went on, the clip cutting before the patrol car door closed. She thought about what it showed and what it didn't. What does he have? She said. He has you at the bus stop, Soane approaching, the exchange, the physical contact with the car. He doesn't have clean audio. He doesn't have the cuffing sequence itself because the angle cuts. Ott paused. But he has enough. Combined with what the statement already says, it's enough. Then he runs it, she said. We don't add anything tonight. Ott nodded slowly. There's one complication. He found out about your military background. She had expected this. How? He didn't say, but he wants to lead with it. Tell him not to. Ott looked at her. That's going to be a hard ask. It's the most dramatic element of the, I know what it is, tell him not to lead with it. The story is a nurse standing at a bus stop asking a question and getting arrested. That's the story. My military record is a footnote. She looked at him steadily. If he leads with the veteran angle, the entire conversation becomes about whether I deserve to be treated better because of what I did in the service. And that's the wrong question. The right question is whether anyone deserves to be treated the way Soane treated me. That question is bigger. It covers Desta. It covers the man named Goret from 4 years ago. It covers everyone else we don't know about yet. Ott was quiet. Then he said, I'll make the case to him. I can't guarantee he takes it. Make the case. He went outside to call. Through the window, she watched him stand on the sidewalk in the early evening light, gesturing slightly as he talked, the legal pad still in his hand. Desta Yoon had gone quiet across the table. She was looking at her phone, reading something. He's going to be famous tomorrow, Desta said without looking up. Soane? Barbas, the reporter. She put the phone down. Does that help or hurt? Depends on what he writes. And you can't control that. No, Nora said. I can't control it. I can shape some of it. The rest is going to be what it is. Desta looked at her for a moment. You don't seem scared. Nora thought about how to answer that honestly. I've been in situations where being scared used up resources I needed for other things, so I learned to be scared later. She turned her coffee cup on the table. Later hasn't happened yet. Some. The Callaway City Register posted the story at 6:47 the next morning. Barbas had taken Ott's note about the lead. The headline read, Callaway nurse arrested at bus stop after asking officer to explain stop. City pulls camera footage. The military background appeared in the 7th paragraph, framed as additional context rather than the driving element. The piece was careful and specific. Quotes from the statement, description of the footage, confirmation that IA had opened a preliminary inquiry, and Desta Yoon's account identified only as a prior complainant with a closed case who had since obtained legal representation. By 9 a.m., it had been shared 1,400 times. By 11 a.m., it had been picked up by the state's 2 largest news affiliates. By noon, the city attorney's office had called Ott's line 3 times. Nora didn't read the article. She had read Ott's summary at 7, confirmed the facts were accurate, and then gone to Callaway General for a shift that had been rearranged to accommodate her situation. She needed the shift. Not for the money, though the money mattered, but because standing in the ER was the thing that kept the edges of this from going abstract on her. Treating people, running the protocols, being useful in the immediate and practical sense. That was the ground she stood on. The rest of it, the attorneys and the reporters and the city attorney's calls, was the superstructure. She needed to remember which was which. She was in the middle of a chest laceration case at 1:40 when her charge nurse, Pat Sorrells, appeared at the bay door. "You have a visitor," Pat said. "She said she's with the JAG office. She's in the family waiting room." "How long has she been there?" "About 20 minutes. She said she'd wait." Nora closed the laceration, 3 more sutures, consistent tension, tissue alignment right, and handed off to the attending, stripped her gloves, and washed out. She stopped at the supply station long enough to drink half a paper cup of water that she'd been ignoring for 2 hours, and then walked to the family waiting room. Commander Arlene Bryce was exactly what her phone voice had implied. Late 50s, precise posture, civilian clothes that were somehow still military in their lack of extraneous detail. She was sitting with a briefcase on her knees and a file folder open, and she stood when Nora came in and extended her hand. "Ms. Vass, thank you for seeing me. You drove here." "I thought some things were better in person." She gestured toward the chairs and they both sat. "I'll be brief because I know you're working. The JAG office has been in formal contact with department administration since this morning. The preliminary inquiry has been upgraded." Nora looked at her. "Upgraded to what?" "Full internal affairs investigation, as of 10:30 this morning." Bryce kept her voice level. "Something came out in the preliminary review that accelerated the timeline." "The prior complaints." "Partly." Bryce paused. "Ms. Vass, there's a third one. Complaint filed 2 years and 3 months ago. A man named Reuben Harkett. The complaint was filed and then withdrawn. Mr. Harkett withdrew it himself about 3 weeks after he filed it." Nora was still. "Why did he withdraw it?" "We don't know yet. The file simply records the withdrawal. Mr. Harkett's current whereabouts are being looked into." 3 complaints. Goret, closed without finding. Destayune, closed without finding. Reuben Harkett, withdrawn. And underneath all of it, the question of who had reviewed those cases, who had signed the closures, and what they had or hadn't looked at when they did. "Who was Soane's supervisor 2.5 years ago?" Nora asked. Bryce was quiet for a moment. "A lieutenant named Cordis Beam. He retired 14 months ago." "And before that?" "Still working, currently a captain, District 3. A pause. "His name is Aldrin Price." The name meant nothing to Nora, but the structure of it did. A pattern of complaints, 2 official closures with no finding, 1 unexplained withdrawal, and a supervisory chain that had been in place across all of them. That wasn't just about Soane. That was about who had been protecting Soane, and why, and for how long. "Commander Bryce," she said carefully, "is the JAG office interested in this because of my case specifically, or because of what my case is pointing toward?" Bryce looked at her for a moment with the direct, undecipherable look of someone who was choosing exactly how much to say. "Both," she said. "Your case is the one with camera coverage. Your case is the one where the documentation is clean. But the reason the investigation was upgraded this morning isn't just what happened to you at that bus stop." She held Nora's gaze. 2 hours ago, Reuben Harkett contacted the department on his own initiative. After seeing the news coverage, he says he withdrew the complaint 3 years ago because someone called him and suggested he would be better off not pursuing it. The family waiting room was very quiet. Down the hall, an overhead PA called for a trauma team to Bay 4, and Nora processed it in the background without moving. Not her bay, not her call. Someone else had it. "Who called him?" she said. "He doesn't know. He says the number was blocked and the voice was male. He says the person knew specific details about his work, his family situation." Bryce paused. "He says whoever called implied that continuing the complaint would cause problems for him that the complaint itself wasn't worth. Intimidation of a complainant. That was a different category of problem entirely. That was potentially criminal. That moved this from a civil rights lawsuit and an internal affairs investigation into something with a longer reach and a harder ceiling." "Does Ott know?" Nora asked. "I called him before I came here." Bryce closed the folder on her lap. "Ms. Vass, I want to be transparent about something. The JAG office's interest in this has always been institutional as much as personal. Your service record made your case visible, but what we're seeing now, a documented pattern, a withdrawn complaint with apparent intimidation, supervisory complicity, this is not something that ends with Derek Soane. I know. The city is going to try to make it end with Derek Soane. They'll fire him, pay the settlement, call it an isolated failure, and implement some reforms. That's the playbook. And you're telling me this because you have a choice to make about how far you want to take this. Accepting a settlement, even a significant one, closes certain doors. If there are people above Soane who enabled this, supervisors who buried complaints, someone who made a phone call to Reuben Harkett, those doors need to stay open. Nora sat with that for a moment. The overhead PA called again. Different bay, minor trauma. She registered it and let it go. I'm not taking a settlement with a confidentiality clause, she said. I said that at the start. That hasn't changed. I know, but I'm telling you there may come a moment when the city offers something that looks very large and is designed to make everything go away very fast. In that moment, it's going to feel like the practical choice. Commander Bryce, Nora looked at her directly. I have spent the last 6 years working with people who couldn't afford lawyers, who didn't have camera footage, who filed complaints that got closed because they didn't have anything in their bag that made a desk officer stop and reconsider. Desta Yoon went to urgent care with a bruised eye socket, and they told her the injuries were consistent with a fall. Reuben Harkett got a phone call and decided his family wasn't worth the risk. She stopped. The settlement that makes this go away doesn't help any of them. The public record does. Bryce was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "All right." She stood, extended her hand again, and Nora shook it. "There's one more thing," Bryce said. "Something I should tell you before it reaches you through another channel." She picked up her briefcase. Soane's union rep filed a counter-narrative with the department this morning. He's alleging that you provoked the confrontation and that your military background should be treated as a factor in assessing your behavior, arguing that someone with your training could be considered a physical threat. The room went very still inside Nora's chest. "He's going to use my record against me," she said. "He's going to try." Bryce's voice was precise and even. "It's a desperation move. It means they know the camera footage is bad, but you should know it's coming." She paused. "It's also going to backfire. Badly. But it's going to be unpleasant in the interim." Nora nodded once. Bryce left. Nora sat in the family waiting room for 90 seconds after the door closed, processing the new shape of the thing. Soane's camp was going to argue that a woman with combat medical training standing alone at a bus stop at 11 p.m. constituted a threat assessment. They were going to put her service record, the same record that had made Myrto go quiet, that had brought Bryce to her door, into the middle of the argument and try to flip it. It was a move born from the particular desperation of people who had run out of better options. She recognized it. She had seen it in the field, in different forms. When the position was indefensible, you tried to reframe the terms of what was being defended. It wasn't going to work. But the attempt itself would do something. It would make the story uglier, more complicated, harder to process cleanly. It would give Soane's supporters a talking point, however thin. It would put her in the position of having to defend the same record she had every right to simply have. She stood up and went back to the ER. At 3:15, between a pediatric asthma case and a hand injury that turned out to be more complex than the intake notes suggested, Pat Sorrells appeared again with a different look on her face. Not the careful neutrality of delivering information, but something with more weight in it. "There's a man outside," Pat said quietly. "He's not a patient. He says his name is Reuben Harkett." Nora went still. "He says he read the article this morning, and then he called the department, and then he drove here," Pat said. "He's been sitting in the external waiting area for 40 minutes. He asked for you by name." Nora looked at the hallway clock. Ott needed to know. Bryce needed to know. There was a proper sequence for this, a documented way to bring a witness into the record, and it mattered because if Harkett's account was going to be usable in any proceeding, the chain of contact had to be clean. But Reuben Harkett had driven somewhere and sat in a plastic chair for 40 minutes, which meant he had made a decision that cost him something, and the procedurally correct thing and the human correct thing were not always the same thing. "Give me 5 minutes," she told Pat. She called Ott first. Told him. He said he'd be there in 30 minutes and not to take any recorded statement before he arrived. She agreed. Then she walked to the external waiting area. Reuben Harkett was 51 years old and had the specific look of a man who had not slept the previous night. He was sitting forward with his elbows on his knees, and when she came through the door, he looked up with the expression of someone who had been running a version of this moment in his head and wasn't sure the real version was going to go as well. "Ms. Vass," he said. He stood. He was taller than she expected. "Mr. Harkett." She sat down 2 seats away, enough distance to not crowd him, close enough to talk. "My attorney is on his way. I can't take a formal statement until he's here." I know. Your attorney told me. I called him first." He sat back down. He had his hands clasped between his knees. I needed to be somewhere. I've been sitting on this for 2.5 years. I didn't know what to... He stopped and pressed his mouth together. "When I saw the article this morning, the story about what happened to you, the bus stop." He looked at her directly. "It was the same. It was the same thing he did to me, and I..." His voice went uneven. He pulled it back. "I shouldn't have quit. I know I shouldn't have quit." "Someone called you," Nora said. "Yeah." "And made it feel like continuing wasn't safe." "Yeah." He looked at his hands. "I had 2 kids still in school. My wife had just gone back to work. And this person on the phone, they knew things. About my job, about where my kids went to school, about things they shouldn't have known unless someone had told them." He shook his head. "Maybe I read it wrong. Maybe it was nothing, but it didn't feel like nothing." Nora looked at him. The exhaustion in his face, the particular quality of someone who had been carrying a decision for a long time and had finally put it down and wasn't sure yet what that felt like. "You didn't do anything wrong," she said. He looked up. "You made a decision to protect your family with the information you had at the time. That's not cowardice. That's a reasonable response to an unreasonable situation." She held his gaze. "But if what you're describing is accurate, if someone called you to pressure you into withdrawing, that's a different thing entirely. That's not just about Soane anymore." He was very still. "My attorney will be here in about 25 minutes, she said. "Will you stay?" He nodded. He looked like a man who had finally decided to stop doing the harder thing in the name of doing the easier one, which was to say, he looked like a man who had just chosen to stop being afraid. Nora went back inside. She stood at the ER bay threshold for a moment, watching the controlled movement of the department, the nurses and attendings and techs doing the 1,000 small, precise things that kept the place running, each person carrying their own portion of an enormous load without acknowledgement or ceremony. Her phone buzzed. OTT. She read the message. City Attorney's Office called again. "They want to meet tomorrow." They mentioned a number. She typed back, "How large?" His response came in 11 seconds. She read it. Then she read it again. She stood in the hallway with the phone in her hand and thought about what a number that size meant, and what it didn't mean, and what it would feel like in 6 months when the memory of this week had softened and the account had a different kind of gravity. Then she put the phone in her pocket and went back to work. She was halfway through the hand injury case, a radial laceration that had nicked the palmaris longus tendon and was going to need a specialist, when the trauma bay doors opened and Pat Sorrells appeared for the 3rd time that afternoon, and this time her face had a quality that was different from all the others. "Nora," Pat's voice was low and careful. "There's a woman at the front desk. She says she's with Internal Affairs." She paused. "She's asking for Derek Soane's personnel file to be held. She says the investigation has been upgraded again." Nora looked up from the laceration. "She also asked," Pat said, "whether you would be available to speak with a federal civil rights investigator." A beat. Not city, federal. The tendon laceration waited. The patient waited. The entire room seemed to pause for just a moment, the ordinary machinery of the ER suspended while Nora processed what Pat had just said. Federal jurisdiction changed everything. It meant someone above the city level had decided this was no longer a local matter, that the pattern ought was building, the withdrawn complaint, the possible intimidation, the supervisory chain that had signed off on 3 closures had crossed a threshold that the city's own investigation could no longer contain. It meant Derek Soane was no longer the story. He had been the story yesterday, and this morning, and for most of this afternoon. But what Reuben Harkett had described in that waiting room, the blocked number, the specific details about his children's school, the implied threat, that was a federal civil rights obstruction question, and someone in a federal building somewhere had read the same news article everyone else had read this morning and had decided to make a call. "Tell her I'll be out in 20 minutes, Nora said, and turned back to the laceration. Her hands were steady. They had always been steady. That was the first thing they trained out of you, the first physical habit the field demanded. Hands that did not shake regardless of what the rest of you was doing. She had sutured in helicopters, in darkness, in the middle of incoming fire, and her hands had always done what she needed them to do. They did it now. One suture, then the next. Methodical, precise, no wasted motion. Outside the bay, in the waiting room, Reuben Harkett was sitting with his hands clasped, waiting for Desmond Ott. Down the hall, an internal affairs officer was holding a folder and waiting for Nora. Somewhere across the city, Derek Soane was finishing a patrol shift without yet knowing that the morning's upgrade to a full internal investigation was already obsolete. That by the time he clocked out and drove home and sat down in front of whatever he sat down in front of at the end of his days, the jurisdiction on his situation would have moved somewhere he could not reach to manage or contain it. And in the external waiting area, a federal civil rights investigator had just taken out a fresh notepad and written one name at the top of the first page. Not Soane's. Captain Aldrin Price. The federal investigator's name was Carla Odom, and she had driven 4 hours from the Regional Civil Rights Division office without calling ahead because, she explained later, she had learned that calling ahead gave people time to make other calls. She was 53, lean in the angular way of someone who had been under chronic stress for decades and metabolized it as efficiency, with a gray blazer that had seen better days and a notepad that she preferred to any recording device because, she said, people talked differently when they didn't see a light blinking. She had been in the Civil Rights Division for 19 years. She had seen the version of this story that ended quietly and the version that didn't, and she had learned to recognize within the first 20 minutes of a case which direction it was going to fall. She recognized it here in about 8. Nora sat across from her in the same family waiting room where she had met Bryce 2 hours earlier and gave her account the same way she had given it every time. In sequence, without editorializing, the same 6 pages of after-action language she had used since the night it happened. Odom listened with the particular stillness of someone who was not just hearing words but filing them against a structure she had already partially assembled. When Nora finished, Odom looked at her notepad for a moment. "You wrote this the night of?" she said. "Between 2:40 and 3:20 in the morning. Before you slept." "Before I slept." Odom looked at the notepad again. "The phone call to the administrative line, the JAG contact. You made that from the property room." "From the property room phone, yes." "Which means there's a record of that call on the department's own system." Nora looked at her. She hadn't thought about it from that angle. "Yes." Odom wrote something. "And the city's position is that this was a lawful stop that escalated due to the subject's behavior." That's what Soane's union rep filed. Odom tapped her pen once against the pad. "Ms. Vass, I'm going to tell you where we are, because I think you're the kind of person who does better with direct information than with managed expectations." She looked up. "The department phone records from the night you were in holding show an outgoing call from Deputy Chief Mack's personal department line at 2:07 a.m., 41 minutes after he arrived at the station." Nora waited. "That call went to the personal cell number of Captain Aldrin Price," Odom said. "Price was not on duty. There was no operational reason for that call." The family waiting room was very quiet. "Who else has seen that?" Nora said. "Currently?" "My office, and as of about an hour ago, the U.S. Attorney's office." Odom held her gaze. "We are past the stage where this is a personnel matter, Ms. Vass. I want you to understand that. What you started by standing at that bus stop and asking one question has opened something that the city is not going to be able to close." Desmond Ott arrived at the hospital at 4:47, spoke to Odom for 30 minutes in the corridor, and emerged from that conversation looking like a man who had updated his understanding of the case's ceiling by a significant margin. He came to find Nora in the break room where she had retreated between a post-op check and the end of her shift, and he sat down across from her and put his legal pad flat on the table between them. "The U.S. Attorney's Office has opened a preliminary federal inquiry into obstruction," he said. "That's separate from IA, separate from the civil case. It's specifically about the call to Harkett and the Mac Price phone contact." He paused. "Odom thinks there are more calls. She thinks the Harkett contact wasn't improvised. She thinks someone told someone to make it." Price told someone to call Harkett. That's the working theory. They don't have it documented yet. Nora looked at this table. 3 complaints. 2 closures with no finding, 1 withdrawal under apparent pressure. A supervisory chain that had been in place across all of them. A deputy chief who drove to a district station at 1:30 in the morning and then made a call to a captain at 2 a.m. The structure of it had the specific geometry of something that had been built over time, not something that happened by accident. How many times has Price reviewed a complaint against Soane? She asked. Ott looked at his notes. Gorett's complaint went through District 4's chain. Price wasn't directly involved in that one. He was a lieutenant then, different district. But he became captain of District 3 about 8 months after that closure. He turned a page. Desta Yoon's complaint. She filed it through the department's central complaint office, which routes to IA. Standard procedure. Except the case was reviewed by a supervisor before it reached IA's assigned investigator, and that supervisory review recommended closure before the investigation was fully completed. Who was the supervisor? Ott looked up. Cordis Beam, Price's predecessor, who retired 14 months ago with full pension and a commendation from the department. The break room hummed with the sound of the refrigerator and the distant PA system and the ordinary background noise of a working hospital. Nora thought about Desta Yoon's photo of her arm, the linear bruising along the radius, the shape of it against pale skin. A fall, the investigator had said, consistent with a fall. OT, she said. Beam and Price. How long did they overlap? He was already looking. 4 years. Beam was captain. Price was his deputy. Price moved to captain when Beam took early retirement. So Price watched Beam close Yoon's complaint. Yes. And then Price took the same position. Yes. She sat with that for a moment. Not shocked. The geometry had been visible for days, and each new piece only confirmed the shape she had already inferred. But there was still something that happened in your chest when inference became confirmation, a kind of settling, the ground solidifying under a structure you had been building in the air. What happens to Price now? She asked. Depends on what Odom finds. If she can connect him to the Harkett call, it's a federal obstruction charge. That's a criminal matter, separate track from everything else. Ott leaned back in his chair. The civil case, our case, that still proceeds regardless. The settlement offer from the city was real, but the number they put forward this morning assumes this ends with Soane. If Price is in the picture, the exposure calculation changes. What number did they put forward? He told her. It was substantial. It was the kind of number that represented a calculation about how much damage control was worth relative to discovery costs. And the fact that they had moved to it this fast, before she had filed anything, before depositions, before a single document had been produced in litigation, told her something about what the camera footage looked like when you watched it straight through. I want to know what's on that footage, she said. The full sequence, not the 40-second clip. I've requested the hospital camera and the streetlight feed. The city is still stalling on the streetlight. Odom can get it faster. Ott nodded slowly. I'll ask her. The streetlight footage was released to Odom's office at 8:14 the following morning under federal request, and by 8:40 Ott had a copy in his inbox, and by 9:15 Nora was sitting in his office watching it on a laptop screen with the sound off because there was no usable audio. It was 3 minutes and 42 seconds long, and it was more complete than she had imagined. The angle was from slightly above and to the northeast. The corner camera had a sweep that covered the bus stop, the adjacent curb, and approximately 30 feet of the approach lane. You could see the patrol car slow. You could see Soane get out. You could see the conversation, both figures visible, Nora standing with her bag. Soane approaching. The exchange of words visible only as posture and movement, not content. You could see very clearly that she did not move toward him at any point. You could see very clearly the moment he reached for her arm. You could see the force of it, the way her shoulder met the trunk of the patrol car, the angle of impact, the specific physics of someone being pushed rather than led. You could see her hands stay down. You could see no resistance of any kind. And then you could see Soane look up the street, one quick scan in both directions, before he reached for the cuffs. Ott paused the footage at that frame. Neither of them said anything for a moment. He checked to see if anyone was watching, Nora said. Yes. Before he put the cuffs on? Yes. She looked at the frozen image. The frame showed Soane's face in partial profile, turned to the right, checking the street. In the background, barely visible at the edge of the frame, you could make out the dog walker. Still half a block away, not yet close enough for her phone to have caught the angle. He had checked. He had looked to see whether he had an audience. And then, having calculated that he didn't, he had proceeded. That single frame was, Ott told her quietly, probably the most important thing they had. Because it was the difference between a bad judgment call made under pressure and a deliberate act made with awareness of its own visibility. He knew it was wrong, Nora said. That frame makes it very hard to argue otherwise. She sat back. Her shoulder, which had mostly faded to a background ache over the past 2 days, tightened briefly with the particular psychosomatic reliability of a body that remembered things accurately. She pressed her fingers against it once and let it go. "When does the city see this?" she said. "They've had access to the request logs. They know we have it." Ott closed the laptop. "I have a meeting with the city attorney's office at 2 this afternoon. I'd like to bring this into the room." "Bring it." He brought it. Nora was not at that meeting, Ott's call, and the right one, because her presence would have shifted the dynamic in ways that served the city's framing more than hers. She spent the time at Callaway General, working a half shift that was mostly administrative. She had been moved off trauma bay duty for the duration of the active legal proceedings, a quiet institutional accommodation that nobody had officially explained to her, but that she understood. The hospital was managing its own exposure. She didn't take it personally. OTT called at 4:12. "They watched the footage," he said, "specifically the frame where he checks the street. And?" The city attorney went very quiet for about 30 seconds. Then she asked for a recess and left the room for 12 minutes. A beat. When she came back, she withdrew this confidentiality requirement from the settlement offer. Nora stood in the corridor outside the hospital pharmacy and absorbed that. "They're still going to want to settle," Ott continued, "but they've dropped the confidentiality condition, which means the public record stays open." "Yes." She looked at the pharmacy window, a technician inside moving between shelves, the ordinary work of an ordinary afternoon. "What do they want in return?" "Expedited timeline. They want this resolved before it goes to formal filing. They want to avoid discovery." "Of course they do." "Nora." Ott's voice shifted slightly. Careful, the tone of someone who had information that needed handling. "I have to tell you something that came out of the room. The city attorney mentioned, and I think this was partly to test my reaction, that Captain Price resigned this morning." She went still. "Effective immediately," Ott said. "No public statement. Department issued a 2-sentence internal notice." "Before Odom finishes her inquiry." "Yes. His attorney apparently advised him to step ahead of whatever the federal inquiry produces. It limits some exposure." A pause. "It also means he's been told what Odom has." She thought about that. Price resigning, quietly, quickly, ahead of a federal obstruction inquiry, was an admission in the language of people who never formally admitted anything. It was a hand raised in a dark room, visible only to those who knew what they were looking at. "Does this change the civil case?" she said. "It strengthens it. His departure is going to be very difficult for the city to frame as unrelated. It's going to be in every story Barbas writes going forward." Ott paused again. "There's one more thing. Reuben Harkett's attorney, he retained someone this week, has formally connected his case to ours. He's alleging civil rights violation and obstruction. If Odom's inquiry produces criminal charges, Harkett's civil case runs parallel. So we're not the only case anymore. No, we are the case that opened everything else. But we're not alone in this anymore." She ended the call and stood in the corridor for a moment. The pharmacy window, the half-shift paperwork waiting in her locker, the particular fluorescent light of this specific hallway that she had walked through enough times in the last 3 years to know it the way she knew her own apartment, all of it ordinary, all of it unchanged by everything that had happened in the last 72 hours. Price was gone. Soane was under federal investigation. Destayoun had documentation and an attorney, and for the first time in 18 months, a case that was going somewhere. Reuben Harkett had sat in a plastic chair in the external waiting area of this hospital and waited 40 minutes because he had seen a news article and decided to stop being afraid. And now he had counsel and a parallel claim and a federal investigator who was pulling phone records. None of it was clean. None of it had gone the way a story about this went when you told it in advance, with all the complications tidied away. Ott was not a perfect attorney. He had missed things early, moved too slowly on the Harkett contact, and he knew it. Barbas had published things that helped the case, but also things that had made the next week harder for Desta, who had not signed up to be publicly named and who had called Nora twice to say she was managing, but with the voice of someone who was managing at the upper edge of what that meant. Commander Bryce had institutional interests that aligned with Nora's most of the time, and not quite all of the time, and Nora was careful about that distinction. And Nora herself was not clean either. She was angry, more than she let show. In the operational way she had always processed anger. Compressed, directional, patient. She had said true things in the right sequence, and she had been disciplined and precise, and she had not made the mistakes that would have let anyone reframe her. But she had also, in the first 48 hours, been afraid. Not of Soane. Of the version of this where the cameras were somehow inconclusive, where Harkett never came forward, where the complaint stayed buried and the report stood as filed, and the city's quiet playbook worked the way it had worked twice before. She had been afraid of the version where she was just a nurse in a holding room and nobody came. That version had not happened, but she had lived inside it long enough to know what it weighed. She went back to her locker, finished the administrative work, and was walking toward the staff exit when her phone buzzed. Ott, again. And she answered. "I just got a call from Odom," he said, and his voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before, but not quite excited, something more controlled than that, but with a current of something underneath it. She finished the department phone records review. What did she find? The call to Reuben Harkett, the blocked number, the male voice who knew about his kid's school. He paused. They traced the originating line. It bounced through a relay, which is why Harkett couldn't identify it, but Odom's team had federal subpoena access to the carrier records. Nora stopped walking. It wasn't Price, Ott said. She stood in the middle of the corridor, very still. The call originated from a line registered to the department's Internal Affairs Division. Another pause, measured and heavy. Specifically, from a desk assigned to the supervisor who reviewed Desta-Yoon's complaint and recommended closure before the investigation was complete. She said the name before he did. Cordis Beam, she said. Yes. Ott's voice was quiet. Except Cordis Beam retired 14 months ago, and the call to Harkett was made 2 years and 3 months ago, when Beam was still active. He let that land. Odom thinks Beam was running interference for Soane independently of Price. 2 separate protection tracks. Price through the supervisory chain, Beam through IA. 2 people. Not one. A supervisory captain managing the complaint pipeline from above, and an internal affairs supervisor managing it from within. Not a single bad actor covered by a chain of silence, but a deliberate 2-track system, each layer insulating the other, each closure reinforcing the one before, the whole structure built to be resistant to exactly the kind of pressure Nora had been applying. And Beam had retired. With full pension, with a commendation from the department. Where is Beam now, she said. Odom has been trying to reach him since this afternoon. His attorney contacted her office 40 minutes ago. He has an attorney. Retained this week. The same week as everything else. The same week the article ran and Harkett came forward and the federal inquiry opened. Someone had told Beam, or Beam had read the news and understood what it meant, because he knew exactly what was in that phone carrier record if anyone with a federal subpoena went looking for it. Odom is moving to formal investigation, Ott said. Not preliminary, full. And she's coordinating with the U.S. attorney on criminal referral for both Beam and Price. He paused once more. Nora, this is not where I thought we'd be 4 days after a bus stop arrest. She looked at the exit at the end of the corridor. Through the glass panel in the door, she could see the parking lot, the evening sky going dark at the edges, the ordinary landscape of the end of a working day. I know, she said. The city attorney's office is going to want to move very fast on the civil settlement now, before the criminal referral becomes public, before Beam's name is in the paper. I know. The number is going to go up, he said, significantly. She thought about Desta-Yoon's urgent care photos. She thought about Reuben Harkett sitting with his hands clasped, talking about his kid's school. She thought about the man named Goret 4 years ago, whose complaint had been closed without finding by a chain of people who had their own reasons for closing it, and who had never had a dog walker with a phone or a streetlight camera, or a former Navy corpsman with 6 pages of after-action notes to stand behind. She thought about what a number meant and what it didn't. "Tell them I want to meet," she said, "tomorrow morning. All parties in the room, city attorney, our team, Odom if she'll come." She pushed through the exit door. The evening air was cold and clean against her face. "I want the terms in writing before noon. They're going to push back on the timeline." "Then push back harder." She walked out into the parking lot. OT, Beam knew what he was doing. He ran that phone call through a relay because he knew he needed it untraceable. He reviewed Destayun's complaint and recommended closure before the investigation was done because he was making sure there was nothing there to find. She walked toward the bus stop at the corner, not the one near the hospital's east exit, a different one, closer to the staff lot. "This didn't start with me. I was just the one who happened to have 3 cameras and a legal pad. I know. Make sure whoever's in that room tomorrow morning knows that too." She ended the call. The bus shelter at the corner had a working light and an intact bench and a panel of transit information that was only 2 months out of date, which was better than most. She stood under it and waited, and the evening settled around her. Traffic thinning, the sky going from gray to dark, the particular quiet of a city winding down toward night. Her phone buzzed one more time. Not Ott. A number she had seen only once before. She answered. "Ms. Vass." Odom's voice, even and direct. "I wanted to tell you before it hits any channel. We executed a voluntary interview request with Derek Soane at 5:30 this evening." Nora waited. "He came in without his union rep," Odom said. "He waived representation." She absorbed that. An officer under federal civil rights investigation walking into a federal interview without representation, that was not a small decision. That was a decision someone made when they had calculated that cooperating was worth more than protecting themselves. "He talked," Nora said. "For 2 hours and 14 minutes, Odom said, "and he named everyone." The bus stop light flickered once overhead, a brief interruption in the steady glow, and then held. "Everything?" Nora said. "Everything he knew." A pause. "Which was more than we expected." She stood very still under the light. "Ms. Vass," Odom said, "there is a recording from the night you were in holding. Department systems automatically record in all interview and holding spaces. The recording from your holding room exists, and based on Soane's statement. This evening, we now know that Deputy Chief Mack was aware that recording existed when he drove to that station at 1:30 in the morning." She stopped. "And we know he made a decision that night about what to do with it." The traffic passed. The city moved around her. "He tried to delete it," Nora said. It wasn't a question. "He requested the overnight systems archive be cleared for routine maintenance," Odom said quietly. "Standard-sounding request, except the department's IT contractor performs all maintenance on a set schedule, and an off-schedule request triggers an automatic backup flag." She paused. The backup flag preserved the original. Nora closed her eyes for 1 second. The recording existed. Whatever she had said in that holding room, every measured word, every request to speak to a supervisor, every calm and precise statement that contradicted Soane's report, all of it had been captured, and then someone had tried to make it disappear, and the attempt to make it disappear had been preserved alongside the thing they were trying to destroy. "What's on it?" she asked, though she already knew. She had been there. She knew what she had said and how she had said it. "Exactly what you'd expect," Odom said, "and nothing that Soane's report describes." The bus came around the corner, headlights cutting through the evening dark, and pulled up to the curb with a sound of brakes and a rush of warm air from the opening doors. Nora got on. She rode the bus home the same way she had ridden it every night for 3 years. Window seat, second from the back, the city unreeling past the glass in its ordinary way. Storefronts, intersections, the gas station on her corner with its perpetually flickering price sign. Nothing had changed outside. Everything had changed underneath. She got off at her stop and walked the half-block to her building and took the stairs instead of the elevator because her body needed the movement, needed something physical and deliberate to process what Odom had just told her. The recording existed. The backup flag had saved it. Mac had tried to erase it, and the attempt itself had become evidence. She climbed 3 flights of stairs and stood in her hallway and understood for the first time since the night at the bus stop that this was going to go all the way. Not because she had pushed hard enough, not because she had the right attorney or the right footage or the right military record at the right moment, but because a city IT contractor had a maintenance schedule and someone had deviated from it, and a system had done exactly what it was designed to do. The quietest mechanisms, she thought, were sometimes the ones that held. She unlocked her apartment, dropped her bag, and sat down at the kitchen table. The legal pad was still there. 6 pages, her handwriting, the same document she had started at 2:40 in the morning the night everything began. She looked at it for a moment without touching it. Then she turned it face down, went to the kitchen, and made a meal that was actual food for the first time in 4 days. Pasta, something green from the refrigerator that was still viable. A pot of water she watched come to a boil because watching something ordinary happen all the way through felt necessary. She ate alone. She did not think about the case. She thought about a corpsman she had served with in the second deployment, a woman named Adayez Firth, who had a habit of saying, after any operation that had not gone the way it was planned, but had nonetheless produced a good outcome, "It's not how you meant to get there." Meaning, the destination was the thing. The path was just what happened. It's not how you meant to get there. She washed the bowl and went to bed and slept for 9 hours without interruption, which was the most she had slept in a week. And when she woke up, the city was already well into its morning, and the meeting was in 3 hours. The city attorney's office occupied the 14th floor of a building 2 blocks from the courthouse, and the conference room they used for sensitive negotiations had a view of the river that was clearly intended to communicate something about institutional permanence. Nora noticed it and then stopped noticing it. She sat beside Ott at one side of the table. Across from them was the city attorney herself, a woman named Hester Gould, late 50s, with the practiced composure of someone who had settled a great many cases that should never have reached settlement, and 2 deputies. To Gould's left, with her own notepad and the expression of someone who was present as a signal rather than a participant, was Carla Odom. Mac was not there. Mac had been placed on administrative leave 48 hours after the backup recording was confirmed. His chair, had he occupied it, would have been at the far end of the table, and its absence was its own kind of statement. Gould opened without preamble. "Ms. Vass, I want to begin by saying clearly, and on behalf of the city, that what happened to you on the night of October 11th was wrong. The stop was without basis, the arrest was without legal justification, and the documentation of that event, specifically the incident report as originally filed, did not accurately reflect what the available footage shows." She paused. "The city accepts responsibility for that." Nora looked at her steadily and said nothing. "We're prepared to move to resolution," Gould continued. "The terms we're offering have been communicated to your attorney. I want to walk through them directly with you, because I think you deserve to hear them stated plainly rather than through a document." What Gould laid out over the next 22 minutes was, by any measure, comprehensive. The monetary settlement had been revised upward from the figure first offered. Significantly, the way numbers move when a backup recording surfaces and a deputy chief goes on administrative leave in the same week. There was no confidentiality clause. The record of Nora's arrest was to be formally expunged, with a written department acknowledgement placed in its stead. Officer Derek Soane had been terminated effective 2 days prior, pending the outcome of the federal civil rights investigation. Captain Aldrin Price's resignation had been accepted, and the department had referred his case to the U.S. Attorney's Office for review of his conduct in supervising the closure of prior complaints. Cordis Beam, retired, pensioned, commended, had been contacted by Odom's office, had retained counsel, and was facing formal federal inquiry into the Harkett call and potentially additional conduct during his tenure as IA supervisor. The department was also committing, as part of the settlement terms, to an independent audit of every complaint closure over the prior 6 years that had involved either Beam's review or Price's supervisory signature. Every one of them, not a sample, all of them. When Gould finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Ott looked at Nora. She had one question. She asked it directly, without preamble, the way she had asked every question since the night this started. "Destayun's complaint," she said, "the closure, the one Beam recommended before the investigation was complete. What happens to that?" Gould glanced at one of her deputies. "Miss Yoon's case is being reopened as part of the audit. She has independent counsel, and the city will be engaging with her team separately." Reuben Harkett. Same. His attorney has been in contact with our office since yesterday. The man named Gorit from 4 years ago. A brief pause. We're locating him. His case will be included in the audit. Nora looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked at Gould. I'll sign the settlement today, she said, under one additional condition. Gould waited. The department's formal acknowledgement, the written statement that goes into the record in place of my arrest, I want it to include the names Desta Yoon and Reuben Harkett. She kept her voice even. Not as a legal finding, as an acknowledgement that the same system that failed me also failed them, and that the settlement of my case does not constitute resolution of theirs. I want that in writing. Gould looked at her deputies. A brief exchange of glances that was not quite a conversation. That's an unusual request, one of the deputies said carefully. Yes, Nora said. Another pause. Gould picked up her pen, wrote something on her notepad, and looked up. We can accommodate that. Odom, at the end of the table, wrote something on her own notepad. She did not look up, but the corner of her mouth moved very slightly in a way that might, in a different context, have been a small acknowledgement. The paperwork took 2 hours. Nora read every page. She changed 3 words in 2 different clauses, and Ott backed her on both changes, and Gould's office accommodated them without significant resistance because they were past the point of negotiating over language. They signed at 12:41 in the afternoon, which was almost exactly 72 hours after Soane had walked into the voluntary interview and named everyone. Theo Barbas ran the settlement story the next morning. It led the paper. He had the settlement figure, the expungement order, the termination confirmation, the administrative leave status of Deputy Chief Mack, the federal inquiry into Beam and Price, and the audit commitment, all of it, sourced and verified, laid out in the particular clean architecture of a story that had been building for 2 weeks and had finally arrived at its full shape. He had also, this time, led with what Nora had asked him to lead with the first time. Not the military background, not the settlement figure, but the bus stop. A nurse standing at a bus stop asking a question. The thing that had started it. He buried the veteran angle in the same paragraph where he had put it before. 7th paragraph. Context, not the driver. He also named Desta Yoon, with her permission. In a sidebar that ran alongside the main piece, brief and specific, her account in her own words is given through her attorney. 1 photograph. Her standing outside the urgent care clinic where she had gone 18 months ago, looking directly at the camera with the expression of someone who had been waiting a long time to look at something directly. Nora read the piece at 6:30 in the morning, standing at her kitchen counter, and then set her phone down and finished her coffee. She was due at the hospital at 8. She had been returned to trauma bay duty 4 days earlier, quietly, without any official explanation. Just a schedule update, and Pat Sorrells appearing in the corridor to say her regular rotation had been restored. Pat had not made it a moment. She had just said it and moved on, which was exactly right, because the work was not a reward. It was just what Nora did. The morning was ordinary in the specific way that only mornings after extraordinary things can be ordinary. The same fluorescent light, the same intake protocols, the same sequence of cases that arrived without regard for what was or wasn't happening in her personal life. A hand injury. A respiratory case. A woman in her 70s who had fallen and was more frightened than she was hurt, and who needed someone to sit with her for 10 minutes and tell her that the numbers on the monitors were fine and she was going to be fine. And Nora did that, because it was part of the work the same as everything else was. She was between cases at 11:15 when Ott called. Mac resigned this morning, he said. Effective immediately. No statement. Okay. The department issued a notice. They've appointed an interim deputy chief while they conduct a national search. A pause. Odom tells me the federal investigation is moving to formal charges for Beam, the Harkett call plus potential additional conduct during his tenure. Price is still under review. They're being careful because the supervisory chain question has implications for the department's liability on the prior closures. Will Price be charged? Odom thinks yes. Not on the same timeline as Beam, but yes. She stood in the corridor and took a breath. The fluorescent light above her hummed at its constant frequency. Down the hall, someone laughed. A real laugh, sudden and unguarded. The kind that happened in hospitals when something small and good cut through the tension of the day. Ott, she said, thank you. You did good work. He was quiet for a moment in the slightly surprised way of someone who didn't receive that kind of direct statement often. "You made it easy," he said. "In the sense that your documentation was airtight. In the sense that you never said anything on the record that you couldn't back up." A pause. "It's not easy to do that under that kind of pressure." "I had practice," she said. She meant it as a simple fact, not a sentiment. He understood it that way. Pause. 6 weeks later, in a hearing room on the 3rd floor of the federal building, Curtis Beam entered a guilty plea to a charge of civil rights obstruction. He was 61 years old, and he looked it, standing at the defense table in a suit that was too large across the shoulders. His attorney read a statement that was careful and procedural and said nothing that resembled an apology. The judge accepted the plea, entered the finding, and set a sentencing date. The hearing took 37 minutes. Desta Yoon was in the gallery. She sat 2 rows behind Nora and Ott, with her own attorney beside her, and she watched the proceedings with the specific attention of someone who had been told twice that there was nothing there to find. She did not cry. She did not look away from the defense table. When Beam was led out by his own attorney, not in cuffs, not yet, that would come at sentencing, she watched him go and then looked at the wall above where he had been standing for a long moment. Nora turned around and met her eyes briefly. Desta nodded once. Nora nodded back. Reuben Harkett was not in the gallery. He had settled his own civil case separately, on terms his attorney had negotiated without fanfare, and he had asked Ott to convey to Nora that he was grateful and that he wanted to move forward without publicity. Nora understood that. Not every person who had been through something like this wanted to be in a federal gallery watching a guilty plea. Some people needed the thing to be over in the quietest possible way, and that was a legitimate choice, and it did not make what they had contributed less important. Harkett's statement to Odom's office, the account of the blocked phone call, the specific details about his children's school, the implied threat, had been the piece that turned a civil rights complaint into a federal obstruction case. Without it, Beam was still a retired supervisor with a commendation and a pension, and Price was still a captain, and the audit of 6 years of complaint closures would never have happened. He had sat in a plastic chair for 40 minutes and decided to stop being afraid. That was not nothing. That was, in the accounting of how this had unfolded, one of the most consequential decisions anyone had made. Price entered a plea agreement 8 weeks after Beam's hearing, a lesser charge, in exchange for cooperation with the ongoing audit, which had by then identified 11 additional complaint closures warranting review and 3 that showed clear evidence of procedural manipulation. He was stripped of his pension, which under city ordinance required a separate administrative determination and took another month to finalize. His attorney put out a statement describing his cooperation with the audit as evidence of commitment to accountability. Nobody who had read Reuben Harkett's account of the phone call found the statement convincing. Mac's situation was more complicated. The evidence against him was strong on the recording deletion attempt, but thinner on prior knowledge of Soane's pattern. His attorneys argued that the 2 a.m. call to Price had been a standard supervisory notification, not coordination, and the phone records alone couldn't definitively contradict that. The U.S. Attorney's Office took 5 months to decide not to file charges, a decision that Odom privately told Nora she disagreed with but could not change. He kept his pension. He was done with the department, done with any law enforcement role, and the civil liability associated with the recording deletion attempt had been absorbed into the city's settlement exposure. It was, Ott said when he told her, imperfect. "I know," she said. "He should face more than he's facing." "Probably," she said. "But Beam is going to prison, and Price lost his pension, and Soane is permanently out of law enforcement, and 11 additional cases are being reviewed, and an audit exists that didn't exist 3 months ago." She paused. "The building is cleaner than it was. It's not clean, but it's cleaner." Ott was quiet for a moment. "Does that feel like enough?" She thought about that honestly. "No," she said. "But I've learned to distinguish between enough and finished. They're different things." The settlement money came through in the 4th month, deposited in a straightforward transaction that Ott's office confirmed, and that Nora looked at once on her banking app and then set her phone down and went to make tea. She had already decided what she was going to do with a significant portion of it. Not in a dramatic, symbolic way. She had never been interested in the dramatic version of this. In a practical way, because practical was what she knew and what she trusted. She incorporated a small nonprofit over the course of 6 weeks, with Ott handling the legal structure and a woman named Bex Tambori, who ran a community legal aid clinic and who had seen the article in the Register and reached out to offer guidance. The organization's purpose, written into its founding documents in plain language, was to provide legal consultation services and documentation support for individuals navigating civil complaints against institutional authority, specifically in cases where the individual lacked resources for independent counsel. Translation: people like Goret, people like Desta Yoon before she had photographs in a parallel case and a reason the system had to listen. People who had a real account and no mechanism to make it matter. She called it the Firth Foundation, after Adia's Firth, the corpsman from the second deployment who had said, "It's not how you meant to get there." Firth, when Nora called to tell her, was characteristically unmoved by the honor and characteristically direct about what she thought of the nonprofit structure. "You're going to need a case intake coordinator," Firth said. "Don't try to run intake yourself. You're a nurse. You'll try to treat everyone you see." "That's not wrong," Nora said. "It's also not scalable." A pause. "I know someone. Former legal aid, got burned out, now she just volunteers. She'd be good at this." "Send me her contact." "Already did. Check your email." This was how things actually got built. Not with ceremony, but with a phone call and a contact, and someone you trusted from a different chapter of your life showing up in your inbox 3 minutes later. The Firth Foundation took its first formal intake case 7 weeks after incorporation. A man named Wesley Carr, 39, who had filed a complaint against a transit authority officer 18 months prior and received a closure notice with no explanation and no follow-up. His documentation was partial. His account was consistent. He had never had anyone sit down with him and tell him what his documentation meant and what options existed. Nora sat across from him in the Foundation's small office. 1 room, 1 desk, borrowed from the community legal aid clinic 2 days a week, and walked him through everything he had in the same careful sequence she had used on her own legal pad at 2:40 in the morning 11 weeks earlier. He watched her hands move across the papers. "You've done this before," he said. "The documenting part," she said. "Yes." "Not the legal stuff?" "Not until recently." She looked at his intake form. "But the principle is the same. You write down what happened in order, and you don't soften it, and you don't leave things out because you think they make you look bad, and you don't exaggerate because you think it makes the other side look worse. You just say what happened." She looked up at him. "Because the truth is what you have. Everything else is just the mechanism for making it visible." He nodded slowly. "And you think that works?" "I think it's the only thing that actually does," she said. "Everything else is pressure. Documentation is the foundation. Without it, pressure doesn't have anywhere to stand." Wesley Carr's case took 4 months. It didn't produce a settlement. It produced a formal finding that his complaint had been improperly closed, a documented note in the officer's file, and a policy change at the transit authority requiring supervisory review of all complaint closures to include written justification. It did not feel, from the outside, like a victory on the scale of what had happened with Beam and Price and the 6-year audit. Wesley Carr called Nora when the finding came through. He was quiet on the phone for a moment, and then he said, "It's in the record now." "Yes," she said. "That matters, right? Even if it doesn't feel like a lot." "It matters," she said. "The record is permanent. What's in it is permanent. Nobody can unfind what's been found." She paused. "And the next person who files a complaint against that officer is not starting from zero." He was quiet again. Then he said, "Thank you." She said, "You're welcome," and meant it without sentimentality, because the work was not sentimental, and she didn't want it to be. She wanted it to be useful. She had always only wanted to be useful. In the late spring, Callaway General invited her to speak at a staff recognition event. She almost declined, not out of false modesty, but because recognition events were not her preferred context, and she was honest with herself about that. But Pat Sorrells called and said with characteristic directness, "We want to say something publicly, and we'd like you to be there when we do." So she went. The evening was unremarkable in most. A hotel conference room, catered food that was adequate, a podium with a microphone that squealed once at the beginning and was adjusted and then worked fine. The hospital's chief of medicine said some things that were accurate about her work in the trauma bay and slightly less accurate about her as a person, in the way that public acknowledgments always smoothed the actual person into a more presentable shape. She sat at the front table and listened, and did not correct anything. When they gave her the floor, she stood at the podium and looked at the room. Her colleagues, some of the administrative staff she had worked with for 3 years, a few faces from the community who had followed the case. Desta Yoon was in the back, with her usual careful expression, sitting beside a woman Nora didn't recognize who turned out to be, she learned later, Desta's sister. Nora spoke for 8 minutes. She didn't use notes. She said that she was grateful for the acknowledgement, but that she needed to say clearly that what had happened was not about her. Or rather, it was about her only insofar as she happened to be the person standing at the bus stop with the right combination of documentation and stubbornness and camera coverage. She said that the system that had failed her had failed other people longer and harder, and that their names deserved to be in this room as much as hers did. She said, "I want to tell you what I've learned from this. And I mean learned, not confirmed, because there's a difference. I grew up believing that if you told the truth clearly enough and precisely enough, it would matter. The field taught me that this wasn't reliable. I've seen people tell the truth clearly and precisely and have it go nowhere, not because the truth wasn't true, but because the mechanisms that should have processed it were broken or captured or indifferent. So I stopped believing in the truth as a guaranteed force and started believing in it as a necessary foundation. The truth is where you start. Everything else, the documentation, the attorney, the cameras, the people who come forward, those are what you build on top of it. You cannot build the rest without the foundation, but the foundation alone doesn't build anything." She paused. "The other thing I've learned," she said, "is about what quiet costs. I kept my background private for 3 years. I had reasons. I wasn't ashamed of it. I had moved to a different chapter and I wanted to live in that chapter without the weight of the previous one following me around. And I still think that was my right. But I've thought about what it meant that when Officer Soane looked at me at that bus stop, he saw someone he could dismiss. He made a calculation. And part of that calculation was that I was alone and quiet and small in the particular way that exhausted women at bus stops at 11 o'clock at night are small." She looked at the room. "I was none of those things. But he didn't know that because I had made a choice that gave him the impression that I was. I'm not saying I was wrong to make that choice. I'm saying that quiet is a strategy, and like any strategy, it has costs. Decide what yours are before someone else decides for you." The room was still. If you're ever in a situation where someone with authority is doing something wrong to you, document it. Whatever you have available, write it down, in order, with the time. It sounds small. It is not small. It is the only thing that travels. She stopped. "That's all I wanted to say." She sat down. Pat Sorrells, in the second row, was looking at the table with her lips pressed together in the expression of someone who had decided not to cry at a professional event and was managing it by a thin margin. Desta Yoon, in the back, was looking directly at the podium with her hands flat on the table in front of her, and when Nora caught her eye, she gave the same single nod she had given in the Federal Gallery the morning Beam entered his plea. Nora nodded back. She walked home that night. It was late May, and the evening was warm enough that the walk was a pleasure rather than an endurance. And she took the long way, down through the courthouse district, through the park blocks, north on the avenue that ran past the Community Legal Aid Clinic, where the Firth Foundation's small office was dark and locked and would open again Thursday morning. She walked past the transit stop nearest the clinic, and a bus went by without stopping, empty at this hour, heading to the depot. And she watched its taillights go and thought about all the bus stops in the city and all the people who stood at them, tired after long shifts, carrying their bags and their exhaustion and their invisible histories. The uncountable number of people who were not small and not powerless and not without complexity, moving through a world that had a habit of looking at them and seeing something simpler than what was there. She had been one of them. She still was. The bus stop nearest her apartment was the one she reached last. She didn't wait for anything. She was walking, not riding, but she stopped there for a moment anyway. The shelter had a new light panel, installed sometime in the winter, and the bench had been repainted. The plastic panel on the east side had been replaced. Small municipal improvements, the kind that happened on their own schedule with no awareness of what had occurred in that specific spot on a specific October night. She stood under the working light. She thought about Derek Soane, Not with anger, which had long since done what she had needed it to do and been set down, but with the particular clarity that came from having seen a situation through to its end. He had made a calculation at a bus stop and gotten it completely wrong, and the wrongness of it had not been because of her military record, or her documentation, or her attorney, or the cameras. Those things had been what made the wrong visible. The wrong itself had been there from the moment he grabbed her arm. It had been there before she was involved at all. It had been there when Desta Yoon sat in urgent care with ice on her eye socket and was told her injuries were consistent with a fall. The quietest person in a room is not the least dangerous. The most exhausted person at a bus stop is not the most powerless. The person who asks one clear question and expects an answer is not looking for a fight. They are looking for the thing that should already exist, the ordinary dignity of being treated as someone whose questions are worth answering. That was not a complicated idea. It was not a military idea or a legal idea or an idea that required any particular background to understand. It was just the idea that people were people, all the way down, regardless of what they happened to be carrying when you looked at them. She walked the last half block to her building, took the stairs again, let herself into her apartment, and set her bag on the kitchen counter in the same spot she had set it every night for 3 years. She picked up her phone. One message from Ott, a case update, brief, handled. One from Bex Tambori about Thursday's intake schedule. One from Adi's Firth that said only, saw the news piece. Good work. Don't get sentimental. She smiled at that and put the phone down. She went to the window. The city was below her, lit and alive, indifferent and various, and full of people moving through it with their own invisible weight. She watched it for a moment. She had been dismissed. She had been handcuffed at a bus stop and dragged away in front of witnesses and written into a report as something she was not. She had been told, in the language of a closed complaint and a deleted recording and a union statement that tried to make her training into a threat, that the story of what happened was not hers to tell. She had told it anyway. And here is what she had learned, not as inspiration, but as fact. Silence does not protect you. It protects the people who are counting on you to stay silent. The only record that exists is the one somebody makes. And if you don't make it, someone else will, and their version will be what stands. So you write it down. You write it in order. You include the time. You name the witnesses. You keep the photographs. You don't soften the account because you're afraid of how it sounds, and you don't exaggerate because you're angry, and you don't quit because the first closed door was designed to look like a wall. It is not always enough. It was not enough for Goret 4 years ago. It was almost not enough for Desta Yoon. There are versions of this story where the cameras are at a slightly different angle, where Harkett never comes forward, where the IT contractor's backup flag doesn't fire, and the outcome is different. She knew that. She did not pretend otherwise. But the foundation is still the foundation, and you build it anyway because the alternative is that someone else gets to decide what's true about you, and they will, and they'll be wrong, and there will be nothing in the record to prove it. She turned from the window. The kitchen light was on, steady and ordinary. The legal pad on the table had long since been filed, evidence now in multiple formal proceedings, and in its place was a fresh one, blank, waiting for whatever came next. She picked up a pen and wrote the date at the top of the first page. Not because anything was happening tonight, just because she had learned to start documenting before she needed it, rather than after. That was the whole lesson, in the end. Start before you need it, write it down. And don't let anyone convince you that asking a clear question in a calm voice is something you should apologize for.